The second part of the Katrina challenge is that after the earthquake hit, or the hurricane hit, there's all this assistance that descended on New Orleans. And, you know, they had these design charrettes, workshops, and all this stuff. And it was all about, well, we could make this community look really different and really great, which was, you know, true in its own sense. But, and, you know, when the planner was talking to me and showing me around, we went, you know, once you're out of the, you know, the French Quarter, which, you know, got bounced back pretty quickly in the Garden District, and Archie Manning's house is fine and all that. You know, you get out to the rest of the community, and the planner said, Charlie, we got charretted to death. Charretted to death. I didn't know that was a verb, but because what was happening is everybody was conceiving this as a design problem. The recovery was not a design problem for New Orleans, it was an economic problem. And, you know, so you can focus on the wrong problem and get a perfectly good solution that's not going to help you, except maybe in some marginal ways. And so it's interesting if you see how New Orleans tried to evolve is, you know, first of all, they had a big population loss. They had a diaspora, and people moved to Houston and everywhere. Their fundamental economic base was out of whack, and you know, it was very poverty-stricken. It looked like a third world country once you got out into the neighborhoods. And what eventually started to happen is little clusters of activity would occur. There might be a school, and there might be a community center, and there might be a few homes, and so on. So it didn't have anything to do with, you know, the grand vision. It had to do with the economics of, you know, new roots sprouting. So that's a lesson of Katrina. Kobe is lots of lessons, but just to differentiate, the lesson here is that you're in a competitive world. And Kobe, I don't know if you're familiar with that earthquake, but they had about 8,000 deaths and, you know, several 100,000 injuries, and, you know, no power for 6 months, and just an enormous, it was awful. In fact, when I was over there, I went back to the hotels about midnight, and there was a call or a message there to call this guy in San Francisco. It turns out it was a KCBS morning news guy. He said, why don't you go on live? You know, and I'm kind of, you know, sort of zonked from the whole thing. So I said, okay. So the guy said, well, what is it like? And I said, well, you know, compared to Loma Prieta, or compared to Kobe, Loma Prieta was a walk in the park. And that's literally, it's hard to imagine how the devastation was. But the point was that I'm making here, in addition to all the other things that they had to struggle through in Japan, is that Kobe, prior to the earthquake, was a major port. It was like maybe the second major shipping container city in the whole East Asia thing there. And their port got whacked big time. So by the time they could figure out to get it rebuilt, all that business went to other ports. The competition didn't stop being there. So the lesson here for everyday planning is that you've got to be aware of, you know, what the broader competition, who are you and who are your, you know, what's your market share or what could be your market share, who's getting what, and how do you maintain that and build that. So that's a lesson from Kobe. Santa Cruz County and Watsonville, this is an interesting lesson. It has to do with politics and paradigms. So in Santa Cruz in the county in the 70s and 80s, the prevailing paradigm was we want to limit housing, we don't want growth. Around Watsonville, the land is unincorporated, and the county said, and the zoning said, we're, you know, preserving all ag land, which, you know, of course is a good thing. But sometimes too much of a good thing is no longer a good thing. Watsonville, meanwhile, felt like they were kind of straitjacketed by these policies. The reason for that is some fundamental things changed. Basically, the apple growing that used to take place in the Pajaro Valley shifted over to strawberries. Guess what? Strawberries, 3 crops a year, lots of labor, influx of thousands of farm workers. County, we don't want to build a lot of housing. That's growth, and we don't want growth. Watsonville, we need to annex. We're dying here, folks. There's overcrowding and everything else. It kind of fell on deaf ears because Watsonville is sort of like the city with very limited power in the big picture in Santa Cruz County. But in any case, not to cast aspersions, it was just, that was the paradigm. So what happens after the earthquake? FEMA comes in and they go into Watsonville and they set up shop, and people go in, household goes in and applies for family assistance grant. Okay, they go in, so-and-so, such and such address, great. 2 days later, another head of household comes in, I'm so-and-so, great, what's your address? Such and such address. Oh, well, we already did that address. Well, that's, my address too. We're 2 households, or 3. And farm workers, 8, 10, 20 in a single family house. So the disaster revealed something that was not politically popular, which was the idea that there had to be some give to the really strong growth control policies, and there had to be some really effort made to house the farm workers. That was not a very resonating political message given the overall paradigm. So again, the disaster revealed a truth that could no longer be ignored. So the trick for you all here is, what are your sacred cows? What's hard to talk about politically? If it's hard to talk about, there must be something there. So that's a lesson. Then Christchurch, I was down in New Zealand, and so they had. This is very interesting. This is about unintended consequences. So we go down to Christchurch, and a big, symposium put on by the university there, and all this, and we're meeting with everybody. And, well, Christchurch ended up, they actually had 4 earthquakes, and these were not just like little aftershocks, these were like spaced out, and by the time all that happened, they were so whacked, it was really scary. But anyway, the people were shook up psychologically. But that said, the downtown in Christchurch was like a lot of old downtowns. It was in a, there's a river going through it, and a cathedral, and all this stuff. Well, the beautiful thing was, we're going in there to help them talk about recovery, and they go, well, everybody's got earthquake insurance. And we thought, great. They'll be able to recover so much more easily, right? The earthquake insurance, what a great thing. Well, here's the unintended consequence. What did earthquake insurance incentivize? It made it desirable to have your building demolished as an individual property owner, because then you could pull out that capital, and then you could take that capital. You became liquid with your real estate. We didn't have earthquake insurance in Santa Cruz, which meant that people were stuck there for better or for worse. So what happened in Christchurch? They ended up demolishing a higher percentage of buildings than they did in Haiti, which is insane. And then they lost all their critical mass. So they had a collective action problem in the sense that each individual property owner saying, give me my capital back through insurance, was actually doing the Stanford Business School thing, but it didn't work for the community. Now it's like a donut hole. They sort of grew around the outside. And, so, and then finally, the tsunami in Japan. All the attention was on Fukushima, but when I was there, we were focused on Noda village up north. And this whole thing was not just focused, it was like 300 miles of devastation. Well, they had these huge sea walls, tsunami walls in Japan. They knew all about this area where I was, that this was a tsunami-prone area. Big walls. And their town was, probably, 1,000 kilometers from the coast. And the tsunami overtopped the wall and went all the way in, and it just stopped halfway in the middle of the town. Point is, you think you've got it. You never can be certain that you do have it. In other words, stay vigilant. Whatever you decide to do, you got to keep reevaluating that. Is that going to work? So that's sort of the windshield survey of some of the truths about planning. And so let's kind of go back to Santa Cruz and maybe get this next slide, please, and I'll start on some of this stuff, just as a kind of a reminder of, when I talked about the windshield, when you have a disaster, the windshield of your car is shattered, and all this look about not changing anything is not possible. But anyway, that's the kind of thing. Just a couple of slides here. Next. So you can see, and think about how things change. So about 10 or 12 years earlier, when I was first working in planning there, I was writing the grants and the applications for doing an historic district in downtown Santa Cruz. After the earthquake, I was the last signature on demolishing, all these buildings. So there's no certainty to anything in the world. But again, I don't really recommend this approach. You can avoid it. And we lost some very dear treasures. I don't know if anybody remembers the Cooper House, but you should go to the downtown now and take a look at it, and you'll see. I'll illustrate some things we did. Okay, next, please. So there's a psychological component that is you don't have to worry about necessarily, but that's kind of where we started from. Next slide. So I think this is kind of where it kind of comes back to where you are, is that what planning has to be first and foremost is a learning process. And being a university town, Santa Cruz, the idea is not necessarily to do anything, but to have a good conversation. That's like any academic. I had a great day, I had this talk and something. So the community was kind of used to that. So the first thing we did is we partnered up with the university and said, we got to start thinking differently, because we don't have the choice. The status quo is not an option. We got to do something. So we created this lecture series, and we brought in, historians and the mayor and William White, Public Spaces Revisited, and another landscape architecture guy from Berkeley, and Alan Jacobs, and anyway, big names from all over the country. But the idea was, the whole theme was, what makes a good downtown? And so that was really important, and because, next slide please, because the early outreach that we did here, the early engagement, the biggest single thing people said when we had our first community meetings, we'll put it back the way it was. We liked it that way. And it's kind of like Humpty Dumpty, you can't put Humpty Dumpty back together again. For one thing, the economics were completely different. And the cost of having Gottschalks pay a lease on a building in downtown Santa Cruz, or own a building and get enough business to make it work is completely different than the cost to Gottschalks to build a brand new building or repair the building they got. Suddenly their basis goes way up and they've got to get a lot more revenue. So we knew that, but the town didn't really quite get that yet. So that was the first thing. So go next slide. Like I said, people wanted back. This is what they remembered, and some of you may remember the old Cooper House. Lovely place. Next slide. But here's where we get back to what was wrong with the downtown. I mean, look at this. So all these trees that were planted in the 60s were these thick, glossy privets. And they were all kind of nice, and there was a great balance of light and sun and air and everything. But being Santa Cruz, of course, once a tree is there, it's kind of a sacred object, and you don't mess with a tree. So then, that was tough for the merchants because, well, nobody can see my storefront, nobody can see my sign, and so business was kind of, like I said, trundling along, falling off a little bit. So it wasn't all so great. In fact, at the end of the day, at 5 o'clock, the downtown was usually vacated. In the evening, the only place that was open was the bookstore and the record store. They used to have record stores in those days. And so it was almost kind of a scary place because there were these big planter boxes and little benches, and it was a lovely thing when there's lots of people there, but when you're the one or two people walking and there's some people that are panhandling or being, problematic in their behaviors sitting in these benches and you're going through this narrow space, it's not very comfortable. So that was an issue. One of the things that we made sure was that when they demolished the buildings, that be sure to get the planter boxes while you're at it. We think we can do better. Okay, next slide. So here's where it kind of got, I was talking about the economics. Okay, so bankers. God, don't we all love bankers? The problem is bankers rule the world. And the fundamental problem for any downtown, whether you're rebuilding or whether you're planning, from where you are now, is to get investment. People's got to put their money in your place, whether that's upgrading your business, building a new building, expanding, whatever it is, redeveloping. Okay, you got to show some reason that that's a good idea, because otherwise the banks aren't going to lend the money. So we had to learn all about economics, which I think is a really important lesson in planning. And you kind of combine this with the Katrina lesson. You just go out and do a pretty plan and you haven't thought about the economic component, you're going to miss out. In fact, you're going to miss altogether, perhaps. So this didn't make people very happy, but that was what we had to do with Vision Santa Cruz, the 36-member committee, we had 3 bankers on that committee, and merchants and property owners. Then we had all the community groups and environmentalists, and it was quite a crowd. And we'd have these long meetings, and then there'd be the after talk and hollering in the hallway at each other and stuff like that. So, but it was really all about people getting their arms around the whole picture and how you be successful. Okay, next. So, and then there's always the voices from the peanut gallery. One of the things we learned was that by having a larger committee, you made it possible to hear all the voices of the zealots at either end of the spectrum, which are important voices, don't get me wrong. They're the kind of the conscience of the community. But if they can't be the center of the center of the action has to be compromise and, working together and understanding each other's perspective. It's sort of like marriage counseling or something. So anyway, of course, then the artists wanted to participate, so they did things like well, we don't know anything about economics. We don't like it, but can we build a lighthouse in one of your? Yeah, sure, go ahead. We're good with that. So, and then this building over here, talk about creative. Tore down the building behind it and saved the facade and rebuilt a new building. It looked like a movie set down there. But anyway, you know, so people were, you know, sometimes less than calm. So there's politics always next. So that is kind of how did we get there? But let me talk a little bit before we do this about the economics a little more, because I'm going to talk about the accelerating trends. So Santa Cruz, prior to the earthquake, we had 3 department stores. We had a men's clothing store, a couple of them. We had a Woolworths. It was looking like a traditional downtown looked in those days. Now, but the downtown, the department store was the old family-owned Leasks that was then bought by Gottschalk's, and you know it was okay. Nobody, I mean, people in town liked it, but nobody came there to shop. They were all going to 41st Avenue or over to Valley Fair or whatever, if they didn't live in Santa Cruz. But, you know, Gottschalk's could make some money. After the earthquake, like I was saying, we did a study that brought in an economist who told us that to support the cost of rebuilding, we'd have to do 50% more business than we'd ever done in the downtown before. And that just seemed like, that's impossible. Meanwhile, Gottschalk said, we ain't coming back. And we had a little Penny's there, and they didn't come back. And we had Ford's, and they didn't come back. And we had Woolworths, and they didn't come back. And so, because the traditional retail was on this thing, on the decline, you see. Now, what do we have on the 100% corner? We have 2 surf shops, an Urban Outfitters, and a new surf shop going in. Specialty retail, entertainment, but retail. Now, men's clothing store today, O'Neill's. Where did the guys buy clothes? At the skateboard shop, right? Not this group necessarily, but there are a lot of CEOs of high-tech companies that probably buy their clothes at, you know, Pacific Wave. But that was where the downtown had to go. We had to understand that. So that's this point about the future. The future became now, and we had to say, okay. And at the same time, we had to change our stripes politically, which was, you know, whatever you do, don't try to change anything. And even the mayor talked about how she had sort of anti-developer body language and had to have the icy stare and all this stuff. And she admitted, you know, I can't do that anymore. She had to start courting people to come into the downtown. So part of our recovery plan was a marketing tool. It was a marketing tool to give people confidence that Santa Cruz was a good place to do something. Well, we got to that point because we engaged everybody and there became serious community engagement and learning, but it was not just wishful thinking. See, the problem, another problem about planning sometimes is that if you have a vision, but you don't have any, if it's not grounded in reality, and if you don't have a way to get there, that's not planning, that's wishful thinking. And I've seen a lot of plans that are wishful thinking. I remember in Santa Cruz, oh, we're going to have 20% people not driving their automobiles by 1990. That was the word back in the 70s, yeah. How are you going to do that? Didn't happen, did it? So that's, you know, that's the lesson here is Santa Cruz figured out that, okay, there's a change in market. What could we be good at? Los Altos, what could you be good at? You know, where are your strengths? There are good retail analytic consultants out there that can help, you know, look at this place, look at the market, look at your leakage, you know, what you're losing, what you could have. And you feed that into the process of the other part of it, which is what do people feel? about the place? What do they want it to look like? What do they want to experience when they walk down the street? That's the design part of it. So you got to merge them both, and you got to understand them both, and they're both really important, because if you have an economic place that nobody wants to be, you know, what's that? At the same time, if you have the coolest looking place in the world but nobody goes there, you know, you've got a bunch of for lease signs out there. So that was part of the economics. Next slide, please. Anyways, I mean, there were some things that we did that, you know, the point I'm trying to make here is that you can have fun with this stuff. So we had a scale model that we built, and we had a downtown information center. We did a scale model of the downtown. And this is volunteers, you know. There was a furniture maker in town named Michelangelo Rosato, naturally. So Michelangelo was there in charge of the scale model. And people would come in and he'd help them, you know, I want to design such and such a building, and I wanted, you know. So literally it was a table about, you know, about this whole front of this room. And you know, people just, it gave them something to really, it helped them focus on the downtown. Now we have more computer simulations and all that stuff, but there's something really important about physically and tactilely understanding something and participating with it. And so that's my point of this slide, is you can think about ways of engagement that aren't just the usual. Okay, next. Again, the point here, the Emergence Center, I mean, that was the point of the big committee, is that ultimately, you know, some of the people at the extremes kind of go, okay, we've had our piece, you know, but they were satisfied. When that plan was passed, it was unanimous. It was unanimous, and nobody was going to vote against it. Part of that had to do with the way we designed the process. Another problem about planning is a lot of times the planning process consists of, you start with a little committee. They do all the detail and nitty-gritty. They really understand the problem. And then they make a recommendation. That goes to the planning commission. And, you know, then they're sort of one step removed, and they go, oh, okay, well, what about this? What about that? And then it goes to the city council, and then it's 2 steps removed from where you started with. And then somebody, all of a sudden, people who've been hanging out in the weeds, sandbaggers, show up and torpedo the thing. That's why the merchants could never get their trees trimmed. You know, it took years to get, finally, 7 trees removed and an agreement to prune some of them. Because, you know, the people that started with the idea weren't the people that were ultimately at the end making the decision. What we designed for Vision Santa Cruz was, we had 3 city council members, including the mayor. We had the city manager. We had planning commissioners. So they had a stake in it from the get-go, and they couldn't just stand back and kind of wait and see. And the other thing we designed into this process was, we're going to do a lot of learning here, and we have to keep this process moving, and we have to get to the end point without going back to the beginning. Remember that game Chutes and Ladders when you were a kid? Remember? You land on the thing, you whoop, back down. That's happens a lot in planning, in politics, and how they interact. We said we can't have chutes and ladders because that'll kill us. So there'd be a debate. We had dozens of subcommittees and whatever of Vision Santa Cruz, and then there'd come up an issue, get debated, decided, done, we're not revisiting that. Move on to the next. And so that prevented chutes and ladders. So we did 2 things, you know, put the decision makers in at the beginning. 3 things. Get the wide participation so you can find a middle, and design it in a way that you don't sabotage yourself. And then we got the technical experts, you know, these guys, Boris Dramoff and Jim Adams and Roma were helping us. Next. Anyway, so then there's always the details, and this is where this is where it got kind of, this is where this idea of the specific plan becomes something to consider. And I don't want to tell you to do a specific plan or not do a specific plan, because it's a particular tool. And all plans are tools. They're a means to achieve an end. They're not an end in and of themselves. So, but for us, the specific plan was the right tool. Why? Because it gave us something that we could adopt that had clear regulations and design guidelines and requirements. It was something we could do an environmental impact report on, so that it was, so buildings could come in and they'd be cleared from environmental review. And it was a marketing tool because it made clear what was what. But what the details were all about was getting this interaction right between what people liked as an experiential thing with what works for retail. So if you go down to Santa Cruz, take a look. There's a couple of the original older buildings still there. Look at the height of the shop windows. They might be 10 feet, 8 feet. The new buildings, 16 feet. Glass. Why? It's visibility into the store. Why? In the evening, light coming out of the store onto the sidewalk. We straightened out the sidewalks and widened them so we could have outdoor eating spaces. And you can do that in a retrofit kind of way as well these days. Then people were concerned about the sunlight. You know, they didn't want to feel of, you know, a cold place, dark place. So that had to do with height limits. Then it had to do with these step backs. So we didn't have these computer simulations. We had the scale model, and we literally had sun lamps to illustrate the sun angle on June 21st and December 21st. And so the design guidelines were intended to maximize the sun while still building more density into the downtown. We had mixed use, and so on. Anyway, distinct architectural elements, no glass and steel. People said, well, you know, we like the way the old buildings were, don't tear down the old buildings. Well, the old buildings, some of them looked nice, some of them were just downright awful in terms of energy efficiency, safety, retail support, you know, how they're designed. We did the old St. George Hotel. It was on Pacific Avenue, it was a Mission Revival style. On Front Street, its other side, it was an Italianate. It's like, what's this is weird. But anyway, the new buildings didn't necessarily replicate the old buildings, but we took elements and features that people liked. So how are the windows set up? What's the vertical horizontal pattern? What's the cornice thing? What's the level of detail? There's no big glass boxes in downtown Santa Cruz. So within that parameter, within the design guidelines, the community made very clear what they wanted. And we spent a lot of time sort of illustrating, you know, what about this, look at that, and so on, to get it right. And I think we did. But then the beauty of this is that, you know, the typical planning process had been, you go in and you got to get a use permit, you know, go all the way through planning commission, city council. It could take forever for somebody to get an approval. And, you know, the investment community said, you're never going to get anybody to invest in your downtown if you don't have an approval process that is streamlined. The specific plan, we spend all the time and effort up front on getting the details right so that here's what you need to design, something that meets these guidelines. Bring it in. There's no discretionary review. It'll be an administrative approval over the counter, a little administrative review for consistency with the design guidelines, and, you know, a little tweaking here and there if need be. The EIR's got you covered. 10 years. not one building needed a hearing. Just went in and got approved. That's what a specific plan did for us. That's why that's a powerful tool. But for it to be effective, you've got to really invest up front, and you've got to invest in a way that the community buys into it and that it works economically. Next. Anyway, then the vision, of course, I had a lot of fun doing this part of it because it turns out my old professor at UC Santa Cruz, Jim Pepper, was on the Vision Santa Cruz committee, so he and I were kind of chuckling together, and we got in the back room, we started writing up the vision statement and all this. Anyway, but the bottom line is we had this nice little vision statement, but we also had, kind of a headline, the civic living room, that kind of captured what it was that people wanted. They felt back to your commitment to your town. It was their place. This is where we live. We're Santa Cruz. We love our downtown. So let's treat it like our house, like our living room. Love it. So that was the vision. Go ahead. And so, here's where we are. I mean, it's not perfect by any means. I mean, we did too much. Prior to the earthquake, the sidewalks had this brick and it was kind of slippery, so we had this traction stuff, but the concrete was too variegated or whatever, so gums kind of sticks to it. So, there was little things missing. But notice the trees. We had big debates about the distance of the trees, and should it be 50 feet, 36 feet. Of course, the old trees were like 8 feet apart or something. Anyway, we settled on like 30, 35, I think it was, and also that they'd be pruned high, right? So you get the benefits, and a different species, something that, not the thick, dense foliage of the privet, but more of a London pine kind of tree. So anyway, so it works. Now, when I was president of the chamber, we said, we got to be looking more at what we could do. And because, while we're doing fine, we did a retail analysis, and there's still a lot of leakage, we could do even better. And so, the retail guy, he did both a macro and a micro thing. He on the micro side, he went into individual businesses and coached them on how to set up their displays and how to get people, as he said, there's something like they have about a second and a half walking by a store to decide whether they're going in or not. So you got to get, capture that attention. So he did that, and then he also did all this analysis on the big picture. Anyway, one of his big recommendations is to have two-way traffic on the whole street, because we have one way, and actually it's kind of a pattern that was a compromise, and this was we have it going in one way and in the other, and when they get to this one block where the theater is, it's two-way. But there were a lot of people that said, we don't want cars, we don't like cars, ideological facts, cars are bad, right? So the cars are bad people wanted a full pedestrian wall. We knew that would be the kiss of death. Because, people said, look, yeah, sure, there's not that much parking on the street, but people want to have the notion that they might be able to park. And they want to see what's there. So that was very important to have cars. But anyway, then the parking spaces were all a big deal, and I had to go door to door with all these merchants and talk to them about, well, we want to put a planter box here, and you lose one space there, and you can't do that to us. Anyway, so there's a lot of little business about the circulation. Anyway, the retail consultant says, go to two-way, and I can guarantee you your business is going to go up by, I don't know, whatever, some big percentage. And so we said, great, let's do that. We got all excited. Meanwhile, the fire department had bought some decade ago a big hook and ladder truck. Guess what? Cities are designed around the turning radii of fire trucks and garbage trucks. So, I'm going to Japan and say, well, they have smaller fire trucks there. We could do that. Oh, no. We got the, so we couldn't do two-way because the fire truck couldn't make the turn unless we got rid of all this parking. And then there was, we don't want to get rid of it. Anyway, so we're still, there's still some struggles today. But the big picture is it's pretty darn good. So I think I don't have anything left here. Go ahead. Yeah, anyway, just some pictures. So that, keep going. I think I've got a summation. Yeah, public art, it's all good. You got to have retail to succeed. You can have all the other good stuff, great. But if you don't have retail, you're only going to go so far. Now you can have specialty retail. We got the Home Depot right there. It's called the Home Gallery, actually. So yoga lamps and things. But anyway. And then we got the sculpture of the guy, Kim, you might remember, Thomas Gribner, playing his saw, sitting downtown back in the old days, and little kiosks and things like that. So people want to be there. That's what you want. You want this blend. You want a place people want to be. You want a place that works economically. You want a place that attracts investment. You want a place that can be who you are. You can't be what you can't be. I mean, this is a really important thing. You're in a region, you have a role in some fashion or form. It's like you send your kid to college. Well, what's their goal? It's not to study this subject or that subject. Their goal is to become who they are. Be that best, become that best of who you are. And that's a challenge for any city. Who are you? What could you be to be better at that? And you can affect that. You can, that's where you have it. It's, it's the old surfing analogy for planning. You can't go surfing and paddle out there and say, I want the wave to break right here at this height. Come on, wave. It just doesn't work. You say, okay, where's the wave? It's over there. Paddle real hard. Get there. Get on the wave. Be creative with the wave. So there are bigger waves that you are part of that you have to understand. And then you be creative within the way you can maximize who you are in terms of that way. Anyway, that's all I have to say. I'm sorry I went on a little longer than that. Yeah, go ahead.
How much, in the specific plan, how much of the street, the traffic, the parking is specified? I saw the building requirements and all that sort of thing. How much did you deal with those other issues?
Well, here's what we did. We have a parking district. So we knew we needed a lot of parking. We knew we weren't going to make individual businesses build parking. We literally counted every on-street space and every off-street space. We built 2 parking structures. Interestingly enough, early on when we were talking about this, one of the planning experts said, hey, having a parking problem is really a good thing because it means you're popular. You want to have a parking problem, so don't sweat parking too much. At the same time, do what you need to do so that you aren't saying you can't be there because there's not enough parking. So the problem with parking and parking districts is you're always a little bit behind your demand. If you're lucky, I mean, in Watsonville, they got this huge parking structure and it's empty. So there's a whole different story. But anyway,
those structures were in the specific plan?
They were part of the original plan. Yes, they were. Yes, sir.
Went to a talk by Don Webb, who's a retired planner from the county of Santa Clara. He pointed out that millennials and the aging boomers actually have something in common. They both want to live in a walkable urban village type atmosphere where they don't have to have a car.
Right.
What do you think about that?
I think that's peering into the future. Yeah, look. So post-war California, planning was abdicated to traffic engineers and suburban developers. And what do you get? You see it all over Southern California. You see some of it here. These spaghetti subdivisions, cul-de-sac, and everybody funnels in and a big wall. And it's great for the car, but what about the people? And remember, when I was a kid, I remember a lot of kids kind of identified with their grandparents more than their parents. I think that gets to your point. The new economy, folks, the millennials, you're absolutely right. Hey, cars, you know, okay, fine, you need one, but you don't necessarily even have to own it. You got the sharing economy. You have smaller cars. Look, I've got a little electric Fiat. I go in the parking space under my building, and I could put 2 of my cars in one space. You know, but I tell you, it's always been a source of frustration for me that you go in and, you know, the fire guys and the public works guys, it's always their standards were delivered from Moses, or from God to Moses on top of the Sistine Chapel, and that's it. And then we're kind of going, come on, guys. So I think that's a good way to start, because a lot of projects get killed because they can't figure out how to meet a parking standard that maybe you don't even need to have anymore in the same way. Yeah.
See, I noticed there's a theater and marquee there in your downtown.
Yeah.
And was that difficult to, I assume it was there before, or is that?
Well, that was, yeah, that's a whole story in and of itself. There was a theater there, yeah, the Del Mar Theater, and they were gone after the earthquake. The building sat vacant. I was kind of sorry to see redevelopment be eliminated in the state. I know there's issues with the schools and everything, but redevelopment was a big deal for funding. And because we had a redevelopment district in the downtown, that was another thing we did after the earthquake. Eventually, it got around to a point where the people that were putting this together came up with a partnership between a developer, the city participated a little bit, then they got a theater operator, and you know, it was one of those layer cake projects where there was public and private participation. And now it's like 3 screens, cinema, and you know, it's pretty cool. Yeah.
A couple of questions. When you did the plan there, how long did it take from start to finish? And what did it cost? And what do you, I know we've talked before, you say you don't know until you get partway into it what kind of plan you want.
Yeah.
But how long do you think it would take now if you were to
Right, well, so, yeah, how long does it take? So it took us 18 months. We sort of started, there was this whole gearing up and sorting out phase between October and January. And it took a while to appoint Vision Santa Cruz because there was a lot of political resistance to that, because some people that were in the power on the city council didn't want to delegate this authority out. They were, you know, used to having all the cards in their hands. So that was resisted, but finally they came around to it. But then it was appointed, and then it spent about the first month arguing of what to call the committee. I mean, this is where we were starting from politically. It was not a great thing. But, you know, the point is, once we got going, we had a 2-phase process. The first phase was kind of the big picture, the principles. We had what we called first principles. And there was the learning, there was kind of understanding the economics, having to do with the big picture, the scale, and this and that. Just the planning area, what do you include, what do you not include? And that took about 5 months, 5-6 months. That was done around May. And then there are a lot of people said, okay, Vision Santa Cruz is done, see ya. We don't need you anymore. And that was back to that sentiment about kind of, okay, we don't really like this group. They're dangerous. But that they were saying, you know, you don't have anything other than a very general set of guidelines. We still don't have a process. So then there was, okay, finally they agreed to do the specific plan and keep Vision Santa Cruz around. We had a grant from one of the agencies that was like $150,000 to do the detailed specific plan in those days. So what's that today? Quite a bit more. And then there were other money that came in for specific studies and so on and so forth. So, you know, it's if you do it right, it takes time. Time is money, okay? You gotta hire people to help shepherd you through the process, and you gotta pay them, and you gotta pay consultants, you gotta pay the retail consultant, whatever you have. That's money well spent if you spend it well. It's money wasted if you kind of get yourself off on a side track. So then the EIRs these days, whew, you know, you can't even look at one for, anyway, probably 100,000 maybe, I don't know. Depends really on so many variables. I can't really give you a budget, because what you have to do is you say, well, what do we need to know? What don't we know? And then we can start putting the pieces together, say, we need this, 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 and this, and here's the expertise, here's what it's going to cost. Kind of evaded that answer well. Yes?
I'm curious on how the council or planning staff in the city, or who drove the process and helped make, bridge all these.
Well, this was this was another interesting thing. Remember that Steve Martin movie where he had the long nose? What was that movie called? Roxanne. Remember that line where they said he was all exasperated because they were a crazy fire department. He said, well, you know, right now if there's a fire, the last thing anybody wants to do is call the fire department, right? Well, guess what? The planning was taken out of the planning department. I was taken out of the planning department and put in the redevelopment department, because there was this sense that all the kind of the way things had always been done was not going to work, and it needed to be clean as that happened. So, you know, that's where it was kind of interesting, because ultimately we had to get the plan approved by the planning commission and by the council, and what we did work closely with the planning staff, and you know, I was still a planner at heart, but you know, it was just a way of reassuring that it wasn't business as usual. It was just a way of making it more of a priority. Anything else? Yeah.
Does the new downtown have like a public plaza at all? And if so,
well, this is an interesting thing. We're yes and no. Okay. Yes, in the sense that the street was designed in a way that we can hold events, and so the streets will get closed off, pieces of them, and become an event plaza. Okay. No, we don't have like a central park. However, the old jail, the old county jail, became the Museum of Art and History, the MA, if you've ever been over there. We just hired, about 3 years ago, I remember interviewing her when I was president of the chamber, and this woman, Nina Simon, she came from DC, she was running the Spy Museum back there. And she has turned this thing into the most amazing, well, we had this one place between the MA and the new building that replaced the Cooper House. There was a plaza, kind of a public plaza, but privately owned. There was just kind of been dead space, never activated. Well, now there's a whole plan, of course, 25 years later, to really activate this space. And I'll tell you another thing that, just speaking of 25 years later, we always envisioned a shuttle between the beach and the downtown, because you have millions of people going to the boardwalk having no idea. You know, it's like how many people drive by Foothill Boulevard or whatever, they have no idea. You got a lovely little place here that, you know, captures some of that. So we always had that in the plan, and about, I don't know, 4 or 5 years ago, again, when I was working with the chamber, we said, we got to get this shuttle going. You know, it never happened, and now we have a rubber tired shuttle, put in, give them a quarter, runs back and forth between Memorial Day and Labor Day to the beach and the downtown, and people love to ride it. So you can always find things to do to build in.
Since we're in this lovely library, I was wondering, what is the relationship between the public library in Santa Cruz and the downtown? I know it's
right
one
there.
or 2 blocks away.
Yeah. Well, in the Civic Auditorium is right there. And so those buildings have always, you know, sort of predated the rebuilding of the downtown, but they added a nice component to it. There, again, anything you got that's a destination that brings people downtown, like a library, that's always a positive. The other thing that's new in Santa Cruz is we built, they got Kaiser Permanente. It's a temporary arena that was built in record time down at Lower Front Street to house the minor league basketball team for the Warriors. So we have the Santa Cruz Warriors, and that place fills up for just about all their games and brings all these people downtown. So, you know, it's part of what you keep trying to do is, you know, find things that make sense that people would enjoy. Yeah.
So I'm down in Santa Cruz quite a bit, and this is just a curiosity.
Sure.
Public bathrooms in the planning process, because the homeless are still there. I mean,
Yeah.
And I'm just wondering, was that part of your plan, or did it?
Okay, so this was a long discussed issue. It's still a discussed issue. There are still people that say, I'm never going to go to downtown Santa Cruz. We had one of the subcommittees of Vision Santa Cruz was a social issues task force, or whatever we called it.